Hello, everyone. This is Butch Bakani from the UNAP's Principles for Sustainable Insurance Initiative in Geneva. Welcome to the webinar on World Heritage Sites and the insurance industry. We know that there's a bunch of people who are out there in Australia and New Zealand and Japan. So thanks for being with us. It's later in the day for you guys. And we also know that there's also a bunch of folks here in Europe who woke up early for this webinar. So it's good to have all of you. Before we get going, I just want to make sure that people understand the technicalities that we have for the webinar. We have 90 minutes maximum. If you finish earlier, then that should be fine. But I also have my colleague here, Olivia Fabry, here in Geneva from the PSI, who's also going to share a few thoughts on the technical stuff.
Hi, everyone. So thank you very much for joining indeed. Just on the technical side, all participants are muted per default. So do not try to speak on the phone because we will not hear you automatically. There are several options for you to provide feedback. You can either write in the chat box or the question box that's on your platform, or you can otherwise raise your hand. If you raise your hand, we will be happy to unmute you for the purpose of you asking the question. There will be plenty of opportunities for all participants to ask questions, so do not hesitate to either write your question in the chat box or raise your hand. Thank you very much.
Yes, and in addition to that, we've made sure that throughout the webinar that there's slots for yourselves to ask questions. So we will pause at certain moments to make sure if everything is clear and if you have any questions. So the speakers for today would be myself, Butch Bakani from UN Environment. I'll also be joined by Chris G, who is the head of campaigns at WWF UK, and also Amandine Favier from the head of sustainable finance at WWF in Switzerland. Okay, so let's get going. So this slide just shows you basically the flow of the presentation. We'll start with some of the fundamentals on World Heritage Sites and the World Heritage Convention. Then we'll get into what are the things that motivated WWF to take part in this initiative on World Heritage Sites. And we go on to how this initiative with the insurance industry came to being and what we are doing right now to support and this initiative of protecting UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And as I mentioned, we have slots for questions, but we will also have a Q&A segment at the end. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass on to Chris from WWF in London to get going with the fundamentals of World Heritage Sites. Chris?
Thanks, Butch, and good morning from London, everyone. If we have the next slide, thank you. So firstly, just to give you a background on what are World Heritage Sites. So they are some of the most famous places in the world with unparalleled natural and cultural beauty, significance, biological diversity, such as the Galapagos Islands or the Grand Canyon, the Great Barrier Reef, cultural value, so Mount Kilimanjaro, the Pyramids of Egypt. And they've all been designated by the UN, by UNESCO World Heritage Convention as places of outstanding universal value, and that's the key word when it comes to World Heritage Sites. So national governments obviously manage and own those places, but they have registered them with the UN as saying they are of outstanding universal value. Next slide, please. So it all started with a convention in 1972. It is one of the most adhered to conventions, sort of ratified conventions in the world. 193 state parties, that is governments, have signed on to the convention. It's unique in that it links together the concept of nature conservation and the preservation of cultural properties. It recognises the way in which people interact with nature and the need to preserve the balance between the two. And it defines the kind of natural and cultural sites which can be considered for inscription on UNESCO's list of World Heritage Sites. Next slide, please. So to manage what does get listed as a World Heritage Site and what doesn't, there are operational guidelines for the implementation of the convention, which the World Heritage Centre, which is based out of Paris, have. And these guidelines, they give you definitions, the process for anything to be inscribed as a World Heritage Site. Also importantly, unfortunately they couldn't join for this morning's call, but IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, playing a key role as an advisory body. So if, for example, I wanted to nominate my back garden as a World Heritage Site, they as the experts would come in and look at whether or not it meets the criteria of outstanding universal value. And similarly, there are bodies for cultural sites, so like ICCROM, which look at the cultural values of a site that wants to be listed. They also, and these advisory bodies, when there are challenges or problems in a site, they provide monitoring and provide the World Heritage Centre with reports, which are then given to the committee to make decisions on. The guidelines also describe for modifications for site boundaries. So if people want to expand the boundaries of their national park, World Heritage Site, or if they said, okay, we want to cut off a bit of this World Heritage Site but add something else, the criteria are there within those guidelines. Obviously, as WWF, we're kind of always a little bit sensitive about if people are saying something that's already been defined as outstanding universal value, shouldn't have its boundaries modified, but there is a process there. There's a process for monitoring the state of conservation, and regular reports go into the annual meetings of the World Heritage Committee, and particularly for sites that are listed as in danger, they have more regular monitoring of their threat. So if a site's in danger, there'll be a report to every single year's conference to look at those sites. There's a procedure for listing of sites as in danger. A few years ago, the Great Barrier Reef was at risk of being listed as in danger. At that point in time, it was the dumping of dredge spoil into the World Heritage waters, and then Australia decided not to allow the dumping of dredge spoil in the World Heritage waters, and so avoided being inscribed as in danger. And there's also a procedure for eventual deletion. So if a site loses the outstanding universal value for which it's been listed, then there's a procedure for saying, okay, that doesn't have the value anymore, let's delete it. So obviously it's not the aim of the World Heritage Convention. It's aiming to celebrate the outstanding universal value of these sites. Next slide, please. So these operational guidelines get updated regularly, and as I said, outstanding universal value is the key, and the definition of outstanding universal value is cultural or natural significance which is so exceptional as to transcend national boundaries and be of common importance for present and for future generations of humanity. As such, the permanent protection of this heritage is of the highest importance to the international community as a whole. So if I'm in the UK and I list, for example, the Lake District as a World Heritage Site, what I'm doing in getting that site listed, and who does that? Well, the site and the government of that country says, hello the world, I want this site to be listed and to be protected, not just for people now, but for people in future. And the governments are making commitments to say these sites should be protected. And you'll see on the left a young hero, Madison Edwards, who is one of the future generation, who recently was campaigning in Belize about the Belize Barrier Reef reserve system that just 2 years ago was threatened with seismic testing for oil very near to the Barrier Reef, and 2 years later now has just come off UNESCO's in danger list as a result of campaigning from WWF and from other NGOs and from the future generations, making sure that they were campaigning to protect what is valuable for themselves and for future livelihoods. Next slide, please. So there are nearly 1,100 natural, cultural and mixed World Heritage sites right around the world. Natural sites in particular provide vital resources, so food, fuel and water. They provide environmental services such as soil stabilization, preventing floods, capturing carbon, and they contribute to economies through jobs, through tourism, through recreation and through exports. So in Belize, for example, the mangroves that make up and the Barrier Reef protects people from extreme weather events, and has been very useful as a barrier to harm to the country. And again, you might recognise at the bottom right the Sustainable Development Goals under 11.4, protecting the world's natural and cultural heritage is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. So many companies are approaching this through an SDG lens as they look at the protection of heritage. Next slide, please. So of course, as WWF, we're most interested in those natural and mixed sites, particularly where biodiversity or species rely on them. It doesn't mean to say that we think they need to be off limits to all kinds of development, but we do think there are some kinds of development that are unacceptable. So there's about 247 sites, 108 countries have these sites listed, outstanding universal value, less than 1% of the Earth's surface. But a couple of years ago, we looked at the threats to these sites. So these are supposed to be amongst the world's most precious places. The kind of places that I'm guessing the CEOs of your companies, when they choose where they're going to go on holiday, some of these places are the places that are the most pristine in the world, listed as World Heritage Sites. I wouldn't be surprised if people are deciding to go to them based on their status. But almost half of these places that should be amongst the most protected places in the world are threatened by harmful industrial activities. So what do we mean by harmful industrial activities? So oil, gas and mining, so extractives are one of the highest and the fastest growing threats to these places. Illegal logging, overfishing, unsustainable use of water, large scale infrastructure projects such as dams, pipelines, roads and megaports. And of course, it can be the case that people are saying, well, we're just building a road, we'll be really sensitive as to how we build that road. But if you do that in the Serengeti, it could become a road that then becomes a road that poachers are using to poach the last of an endangered species, and inevitably harmful developments can follow. Next slide, please. So I'll take any questions at this point. So if people can raise their hands, and Olivia, if there are questions, just pause for a second. People can put them in the chat box or raise their hand if they do have a question at this point. There's no questions at this point. Shall we move on?
I think, Chris, there's none at the moment, so I think it's okay to carry on. Yeah.
Yep. So next slide, please. So how did WWF get involved in the protection and the need to campaign to protect our World Heritage Sites? So Virunga National Park in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there was a UK oil company, Soko, who were looking to explore for oil inside Virunga National Park in the Democratic Republic of Congo, home to the endangered mountain gorillas. And what we did do was sort of say, well, this just is unacceptable. Now, why did we say that? Well, because the World Heritage Committee has said that oil, gas and mining are incompatible with World Heritage Site status. So clearly there's an issue at play in that the government of the country has had the site listed, has then sold oil concessions that overlap the World Heritage Site. The company has bought that, And then obviously there are investors, banks and insurers who are investing in or banking or insuring those companies, which is enabling them to go ahead with issues like this. So what we did was we launched a campaign, we got some celebrities, we took SOCO to the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprise. We took a complaint in the UK against them, saying that it was because World Heritage Sites extractions and World Heritage Sites are incompatible. They shouldn't be going into Virunga. And the outcome of that, and you see an advert on the right, which we took out in the Financial Times to warn investors and banks and insurers, and obviously made some bilateral connections. And the outcome of that was that SOCO decided not just to not go into and close down their operations in Virunga National Park, but also to make a policy that said they won't go into any World Heritage Sites anywhere in the world. They won't go to any World Heritage Sites or their buffer zones. So we saw the opportunity. We mobilised hundreds of thousands of people. We engaged companies. But as we looked at this, we started to see that it wasn't just a problem in DRC and in Virunga. This was a much bigger problem. Next slide, please. Again, it's also a material problem because SOCO had to write off 43.9 million on its Virunga venture, and in the Telegraph they described this as an expensive, painful experience we would not repeat as they made their policy. Next slide, please. So as I said, incompatible with World Heritage Site status, and the World Heritage Committee said they're calling on other companies in extractive industries and investment banks, and I think also by implication they also mean the wider financial sector and insurance, to follow these examples and further extend their no-go commitment. So what do they mean by that? Well, the International Council of Mining and Metals, ICMM, has made a no-go commitment for its member companies, as has Shell. That was followed by Total, who also had a concession that overlapped Virunga, but they chose to make a no-go commitment, SOCO, and then since then Tullow Oil. So about 2/3 of the mining industry has a policy to respect these places covered by ICMM, and about 2% of the oil industry has a policy in place to respect these places. Next slide, please. Here you see a map we did a couple of years back, and the orange flags you'll see are World Heritage Sites where there is, this is looking just at extractive threats, not other infrastructure threats. So if you look at just extractive threats, you'll see quite a number of these sites that should be amongst the world's most protected places facing threats of extractive activity. Now, we want to be clear, this isn't the case that there is live exploration in every one of these. It is a case that a company has bought a concession that overlaps a World Heritage Site. Now, they could have a concession that is a massive concession of which a tiny part overlaps a World Heritage Site. But of course, operations in the site or near to the site can have risks to these sites, and the World Heritage Committee has been clear. So next slide, please, and we'll just run you through the kind of parts of the world that have extractive threats. So Africa, 61% of natural and mixed World Heritage Sites faced these threats. Asia and the Pacific, it was 34% we identified as facing these threats. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, it was 31% of these sites that faced these threats. Overall, globally, it was about 1/3. So that's when we realized there was a big problem here. So we launched a campaign. Please do go back to that next slide, that's fine. We launched a campaign on protecting World Heritage Sites. We underpinned that with our report, Protecting People Through Nature. And that report did outline that half of all World Heritage Sites, natural World Heritage Sites, are threatened by harmful industrial activities. We also outlined that 11 million people plus his livelihoods rely on these sites being protected. So people who live in or near to these sites and rely on the value these sites provide. Next slide, please. And so when we launched our campaign, and if we just machine gun through some of the coverage around the world, the Times, Agence France Presse, BBC, Al Jazeera, Le Monde. So when we do decide to launch a campaign, we do seem to get lots of coverage around the world on these issues, whether it be the Guardian, the BBC, Al Jazeera, Fortune, We also get influencer, so IUCN there, ICMM supporting the campaign because they do have a no-go policy, the OECD highlighting that as well, and Roel, who's the chair of the Working Party for Responsible Business Conduct, UNESCO flagging the risks of the Belize Barrier Reef, and then those flagship sites. So if you just move to the next slide. So we picked 3 flagship sites around the world to campaign on: the Belize Barrier Reef, Selous Game Reserve in Tanzania, and Doñana in Spain. So Belize was on the endanger list, as was Selous. Doñana was threatened with going on the endanger list. And we mobilized our supporters to, with advocacy actions to the prime ministers and presidents of these countries. So this was kind of the public end of our campaign, where we were trying to show live threats and show that people cared, in country, but also globally, because these are sites listed for all of mankind and for future generations. And that was the public face of the campaign. But we also realised as WWF, we aren't going to win this site by site by site with so many sites threatened. We needed to address some of the systemic drivers that caused these sites to come under threat. So next slide, please. I'll pass on to my colleague Amandine from WWF Switzerland, who will just mention Grupo Mexico.
Yes, good morning, everybody. It's Amandine from WWF Switzerland. I'm just going to start with just 2 concrete case studies to show you a bit more, or give you a bit more concreteness on what does that mean when a site is in danger. So the first case study is about a company called Grupo Mexico, which is the 4th largest copper producer in the world. They are mining lead, silver, zinc, and gold. They also engage in more infrastructure activities. They are listed on the Mexico Stock Exchange. And they have activities, let's say, in two World Heritage sites. The first one is the Doñana National Park in Spain, where they were a couple of years ago. There were a huge environmental catastrophe. Was one of the worst ecological catastrophe in Spain and in Europe, where a mine called Los Frailes just bursted. 45 kilometers outside, actually, of the World Heritage Site, and he ended up in a major spill. In around 25,000 kilos of dead fish were gathered. A lot of birds died. I mean, it was a very, very bad event. And actually, the mine was closed. And in 2016, they decided, or 2015, sorry, the government awarded the mines to the Grupo Mexico. We decided to reopen the mine, and the mine, it's estimated that they will get into exploitation phase by 2020. So it's a good example of an activity and a mining activity happening outside a World Heritage Site, which clearly had very bad effect within the site. The second example is still Grupo Mexico, which got awarding a concession, again, another mining concession in the state of Michoacán, in really the heart of the monarch butterfly biosphere reserve, which is in Mexico, a very iconic species, the monarch butterfly, which is also a very famous natural park and site for Mexico. And they are planning as well to have mining activities within this World Heritage Site, which was inscribed by UNESCO in 2008. And yeah, so that just was like a snapshot on one company which has one way wants to have activities, or is planning to have activities outside the site on a mines who in the past were already like the activity of the mine in the past already led to major impact on the universal value of the site, and also wants to have activity within a World Heritage Site. Next slide, please. The next slide, it's about another flagship site from our campaign, the Selous Game Reserve in Tanzania. So the Selous Game Reserve in Tanzania is one of the largest and oldest natural park in Africa, and the only World Heritage Site in Tanzania. It's the size of Denmark. It has the most significant concentration of African elephant. A few black rhinos are there. They have giraffe cheetahs in the world. I mean, it's a very, very rich biodiversity there in this park. And basically, as you can see in this map, and you can see it very well, there is a lot of mining and oil and gas activity, which are really eating the park, let's say, or within the park. And in green, you can see the World Heritage Site border in the park. And in red, you can see oil and gas concession awarding. In yellow, it's a mining concession, which we're awarding. And when you have a red triangle, it's active mining concession. We estimate today that there is around 5 active mining concession in the park, over 5 active mines, sorry, and over 50 mining concession, and owned by 23 different owners, and there is around 6 oil and gas concession. And this kind of information on this map you see was given by our own intelligence. We have developed a tool called the Site tool, which is giving us really information on overlap oil and gas mining, and actually has also hydropower activity with World Heritage Site, and we also get information on ownership. And this is an intelligence we have to develop for the campaign. And you can also, so basically now in 2012, the government of Tanzania has committed to remove all mining concession, which was a very good news from the Selous National Park. But the new threat arose, and there is a plan to build a very large hydropower dam. It's called the Stigler Gorge project, and this dam will flood a large part of the site, a part where you also have the last black rhino, and this is why also it was this project was recognized as a threat officially by UNESCO in the last UNESCO annual meeting, and it's a reason why the park is also listed as in danger. Yep, next slide, please. So also those 2 examples, I give you good example on what we have been learning over the last few years, and by doing the campaign, that there is for us 3 main factors that contribute to enabling threat within a World Heritage Site. The first one is government, who are signed the convention but are still inviting industrial company into this area, so breaching in a way their commitment. Company which are either unconcerned or simply ignorant about this area and their protected status, and financial institution, insurance, banks, and investors who find themselves lending or insuring or investing in projects that are not environmentally sound. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm just going to give you a very short summary of what we call the journey of working with the industry on World Heritage Site. Like you have heard from Chris, it started really with the campaign on this particular site, the Virunga National Park, and our work with Soko. We end up at the end, Soko and Total, both companies getting outside, stopping their activity within Virunga National Park, and Soko really committing, and Total as well, to no-go commitment for World Heritage Site. We also engage with the oil and gas industry, but we have been after, so that was the first time that actually WWF really worked with investors and banks back then. So we contacted all the investors, and we contacted many of the financiers of Total and Soko, and really talked with them, trying to get them to engage with both companies and express their concerns. And this was one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons why both companies decided to really stop their activity and decided to have a stricter policy on protected areas. We moved after to working a bit closer with investors. We published the report together with Aviva and Investec, called Safeguarding Outstanding Natural Value, where we really mapped threat to World Heritage Sites. So some of the maps you saw that Chris presented before were extracted from this report. One of the investors that also have been moving quite a lot was the Church of England, who has adopted a no-go policy on World Heritage Site recently. We also worked quite intensively with banks over the last 2 years. we have worked with a group of 10 international banks on publishing a guidance report on how can banks ensure that they have a policy on World Heritage Site and how can they implement those policy in an efficient way. And the result of this engagement with this group of banks, of global banks, was the report we published in 2017, last June, on how banks can safeguard our World Heritage Site. Since then, a number of banks actually have moved, and it was quite a success for us when recently Barclays and Standard Chartered has adopted a new and stricter policy on World Heritage Site. We also have 2 banks in Southeast Asia that adopted new and stricter policy. So our engagement was led to some improvement, and we are very happy of that, and we were very happy to be able to publish this guidance report to support the industry. And now we are decided, or we're very happy to be working with the insurance industry, and we are really pleased to start engaging the insurance sector and work with the UNPSI on insurance industry action. And we are really looking forward working together. Next slide. Is there any question?
There is a question, Amandine. We have James Wallace from Allianz. And James actually asked, should insurers provide environmental liability cover for companies near these areas? So there's a kind of insurance that covers industrial activities, industrial companies' liabilities if they pollute and damage the environment. So perhaps one question is based on the engagement that WWF has had with these companies, have you checked whether they have environmental liability cover? And do you think that such an insurance cover would be helpful?
Yeah, that's a good question. When we started with working on those Total and Soko case, we haven't engaged insurance, to be honest. We started really with investors and banks, and actually we are right now learning, and we really would like to engage more with insurance. That's why we are partnering with the PSI on this initiative. And this is a kind of question we need to answer actually in the future. My first answer will be that it would be great if the insurer could first engage with their clients on those topics and try to understand better the situation. If they will not do, you need to identify if the activity outside the park will actually damage the park, and there's not a general answer. I think it's a case by case discussion, and I have the feeling that having an insurance for such a damage would be better, but it's a complex question, and I think something we will be very pleased to take on and discuss further as part of the project.
Thank you. And obviously, the provision of insurance also entails risk assessment and risk reduction measures. So there is, I think, at least from my perspective, a benefit of insurers looking into this topic. James, you also asked about similar principles for banks. Are there similar principles or frameworks for banks that they sign up to, Amandine?
Well, for banks, like I said, we've been engaging with a global group of 10 banks, and we published this guidance report that we actually really were disseminated quite largely in the industry. We organize workshops as well. The thing is, there is not equivalent initiative as a PSI for banks. That's just very simple. So there's a PRI, there's a PSI, but there is no real today overall global banking principle, and it's a project that is getting on. But as it's not existing, we have not yet, we have not yet done the same collaboration as with the banking industry. We did more a case by case, and we had a lot of bilateral discussion. We have been engaging over 19 banks over the last year bilaterally which was a lot of work. But I say it will be more systematic to have such principle for banks. But for that, you need, I think, to have a global principle for bank first, like a global body, which is not the case today yet.
Right, and the good news for you, Amandine, is that UNAP Finance Initiative will be coming up with the draft Principles for Responsible Banking by the UNAP Finance Initiative Global Roundtable in Paris this November. So, and they will be launched next year. So this is a really good opportunity for the World Heritage Sites agenda to have a similar collective industry-wide engagement as what is happening right now through the PSI.
Yes.
Okay, and there is also a question from ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. Is it possible to protect heritage sites from climate change, inevitable consequences, and man-made disasters? Also, terrorism.
Can you repeat? Or Chris, do you want to take this one?
Is it possible to protect World Heritage Sites from the inevitable consequences of climate change and also man-made disasters?
I think, Chris here. So from climate change, I think we've again focused our campaign and the work we've done on the industrial scale threats that are easier to manage. Now, obviously, some of those have knock-on implications for climate change. So large-scale mining in some of those places will have implications for climate change. So medium to long term, the World Heritage Committee are doing work on assessing climate change and the risks. So those are reports on marine World Heritage sites and their threats, for example, of coral bleaching, and looking at those solutions. I don't know if there's an insurance way of looking at this, and that's clearly something that could be part of an ongoing discussion. In terms of natural and man-made disasters, and there are cases of things like cruise ships striking coral reefs, and I think it was in the Philippines or Indonesia, I'm trying to remember, where again more careful planning of that tourism would probably have resulted in that accident not having happened. So I think there's a real important role for whenever there is business that comes near to or into a World Heritage site, a really careful discussion of assessing the risks to the value of the site. And I think, in our view, if banks and investors and insurers are all asking those questions of the companies who are taking those risks, it becomes much more likely those companies will have plans in place to minimize those risks. So that's my quick response.
Right, and I can respond to that as well. Yes, it's possible, and this is one of the reasons, one of the opportunities for engagement with the insurance industry is how can we harness the risk management, insurance, and investment influence of the insurance industry in protecting World Heritage sites. So on the risk management side of the agenda, to what extent can the risk analytics and the modeling of the industry be applied to World Heritage sites in order to better understand the exposure and vulnerability, and what are ways to be able to reduce that risk? Insurance solutions could also include not simply for the infrastructure or man-made infrastructure, but also green infrastructure or ecosystems. And obviously, investments by insurers in low-carbon technologies are also beneficial in terms of reducing not only pollution, but also greenhouse gas emissions, which could potentially damage natural World Heritage sites, for example. So ocean acidification as a consequence of climate change are things that are affecting heritage sites like the Great Barrier Reef, for example. Okay, I think those are the questions that we've got so far, and so we'll move on. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Amandine. So I'm gonna continue with the presentation. So the one thing that I think I wanted to highlight based on what Amandine has said is that WWF has engaged financial institutions on a company by company basis. So they've spoken with folks like Standard Bank, Barclays, etc. But the engagement with the PSI is unique in a way that it is the first time that they're looking at it from an industry-wide perspective. So the PSI being a collaborative initiative between the UN and the insurance industry encapsulates that agenda. The other unique thing is that UNESCO is firmly behind us as part of this initiative. So the folks who are inscribing sites and delisting them where relevant are the ones also who are backing us here in the UN on this initiative and firmly behind us. So I think this gives us, in a way, this makes the initiative quite novel compared to the single company engagements that have been done so far. And this presents opportunities and also challenges, given that this is something that's quite new. So one of the things that we did, obviously, is to see how the insurance industry across its risk management, insurance, and investment influence, what could be done by the insurance industry on this agenda. And we were able to work with PSI members in shaping a statement, which we launched at the World Heritage Committee meeting in Manama in Bahrain a couple of months ago. So for those of you who are very active on the climate change agenda, adaptation and mitigation, you're familiar with the UN Climate Change Conference that happens every year towards the end of the year, the Conference of the Parties. So this World Heritage Committee meeting that happens every year is the World Heritage Site equivalent of the Climate Change Conference that happens every year. So we were there in Manama to be able to launch this statement. So what are the commitments on this statement? So the first one really is a data and knowledge commitment. To what extent are insurers able to work together with different stakeholders? We know that there are some data challenges as far as World Heritage Sites is concerned. How can we enhance the data and information on these sites? And how can we better understand best practices in protecting World Heritage Sites, understanding the operational guidelines? Chris already explained the convention as they are relevant to your business. Obviously, there are different cuts of insurers. You can be a monoline motor insurer. You can be a multi-line global insurer. You can be a life and health insurer. So depending on what is the line of business that you are working on. Number two is really the awareness goal. How can we, and this basically chimes in for yourselves also who have signed the Principles for Sustainable Insurance. Principle 3 says we will work together with governments and regulators and civil society on promoting ESG issues. And this is basically a World Heritage Site equivalent of that principle of raising awareness and supporting widespread action on this agenda. If we move on to the third commitment is to how do you really embed this agenda in your core business activities. So this could be signing on to frameworks like the PSI, which you have done, or the Principles for Responsible Investment, or going deeper and having specific guidelines and processes and policies within your companies that are specific to World Heritage Sites. That's another option. And obviously, the more granular it is, the more concrete and more effective. And obviously, whenever possible as well, there's an understanding, obviously, that, for example, on insurance and reinsurance transactions, there's 1 million insurance and reinsurance transactions, and reinsurance business can be both facultative reinsurance on case by case, where a reinsurer could see the risk, or there could be 1,000 sessions in a reinsurance treaty agreement where it's a little bit more difficult to monitor such activities. So these are the types of things that insurers can do. The common denominator for all participants on this call is that you have signed the PSI. So that is already a set of principles that makes a company aware of environmental, social, and governance issues, but obviously you can go deeper. And that commitment really goes into the heart of the statement of preventing and reducing, because ultimately no one wants to have a loss, no one wants to damage the outstanding universal value of World Heritage Sites. And if we can do that, that's the best way to protect them. But unfortunately, there have been instances where their outstanding universal value has been damaged, as already explained by Chris and Amandine earlier. There's also the agenda of the goal of protecting World Heritage Sites through risk management, insurance, and investment. So on risk management, I already alluded to earlier, how could we use the risk analytics of the insurance industry in assessing the hazards and exposures and vulnerabilities of World Heritage Sites? To what extent has that been harnessed? My own perception is that it hasn't been fully harnessed for that purpose. And that really becomes a starting point of better understanding risk, and that could also complement the commitment on 3 to prevent and reduce risk. Insurance products, I mean, James of Allianz actually put forward a very good question about environmental impairment liability cover. Is that an opportunity for insurers? In addition to that, we know that certain insurers, like Swiss Re, have already engaged in looking into insurance for natural ecosystems like the Mesoamerican Reef in Mexico. And obviously, we're talking about cultural and also natural World Heritage Sites. So to what extent can insurance products be designed for natural ecosystems like coral reefs or forests can also be an opportunity. And also the investment angle, whether infrastructure that could protect sites or investments in green technologies that could actually reduce emissions, which ultimately impact and degrade ecosystems and make oceans more acidic, are areas which could be explored also in the context of the role of the insurance industry. And then the fifth one is really engaging with companies on their disclosure. So this is really transparency, understanding to what extent insurers can engage with companies you underwrite or invest in as far as their activities that could damage these sites, and to what extent can you encourage them to adopt industry standards and practices to protect these places. So an example that Chris already cited is the ICMM, the International Council of Mining and Metals, have made a no-go commitment that applies to all their members, preventing extractive industry activities in World Heritage Sites. So this could be an example of a form of engagement where an insurer can say, why don't you follow certain standards as well for your particular industry. So let's move on. Swiss Re is one of those global insurance and reinsurance companies that have actually come up with a sustainability risk framework that has been made public for several years now. And one of the things that Swiss Re has done, and this is something that a framework that they apply to both their insurance and investment transactions. One of the things that are on the foundation of this framework are the umbrella policies that covers not only environmental issues but also human rights. And obviously beyond general principles and policies across human rights and the environment, they have gone deeper and looked at specific sectors where there are sensitive business transactions involved. And a number of which have already been highlighted in this webinar so far. And that includes mining, dams, forestry, oil and gas, but there are others also there, nuclear, defense sector, animal testing that Swiss Re is looking into. If we go on to the next slide. So if you dig deeper into what Swiss Re has done, they have highlighted, for example, dams, and what are the implications of such projects, not only in the environmental context, but also in the context of human rights and labor rights, and how this could impact, for example, cultural heritage, such as UNESCO sites, and also the impact on biodiversity. The next slide, please. They've also gone very specific on mining, looking at, again, the human rights agenda, child labor, but also specifically UNESCO World Heritage Sites and even protected areas, which go further than UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And they have also looked into initiatives like the International Council on Mining and Metals and their commitment to sustainability and how this is relevant for a global reinsurer and global investor such as Swiss Re. If you go on to the next slide, Swiss Re has also created a risk framework where they're able to look into these transactions, and they have basically an internal process on how issues affecting insurance and investments are referred to internally, and how this could be managed within the Swiss Re organizations. And I know based on conversations with Swiss Re that this is led by the team, the sustainability team in Zurich here in Switzerland. But if you go to Brazil and speak with the Swiss Re underwriters in Brazil, or if you go to Washington, D.C. and talk to Swiss Re America and the people there, they are also implementing this risk framework. So this is led here in Switzerland, but globally applied by Swiss Re. If you go to the next slide, please. These are a little bit dated stats, but it gives a flavor of the types of issues within the sector guidelines that Swiss Re have gone deeper into. Look in terms of the risks that they are facing. So there's a bunch. The largest proportion is on mining. Basically, extractives are the biggest portion, which is also why the WWF campaign on World Heritage Sites has largely focused on the extractive industry. And this is also what we are seeing based on Swiss Re's experience so far. To go to the next slide. So this is quite a novel PSI initiative, as we have already seen that this is something that has not yet existed for the banking industry, for example. But within the PSI, it's not only a standalone initiative, it also is actually relevant to other PSI initiatives out there. So for example, it's good that James of Wallace of Allianz is on this call. He is leading a global PSI initiative on how environmental, social, and governance issues are embedded and factored into non-life insurance underwriting. So we just did a global survey that had 200 underwriters and stakeholders around the world populating a survey asking questions about the implications of child labor and carbon emissions and negative impacts on heritage sites on non-life insurance underwriting. So these are the type of things that actually make sustainability and ESG-wide narratives and initiatives there actually very concrete. And obviously, that is only one issue. There's also the issue of human rights and child labor, there's pollution, etc. And some of them are in fact interrelated. As Chris has mentioned earlier, there are others like illegal logging, which also are related to World Heritage Sites. Obviously, the Grupo Mexico example of Amandine looks into pollution as well and deforestation. So these are things that are actually interrelated as well. So we're quite happy that this initiative on World Heritage Sites also reinforces other initiatives of the PSI. And in fact, we're looking at the Allianz event in Munich in February on when we launched the ESG and guidance for non-life as another opportunity to engage on the agenda of World Heritage Sites. Next slide, please. And that's not the only PSI initiative that's relevant. So in June, we were in Montreal. After 1 year of engaging with insurers and mayors and local government officials, we wanted to understand how a specific sustainable development goal on cities to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, and the different targets under that SDG 11 could basically be translated into risk management, insurance, and investment goals for the insurance industry. So let's go on to the next slide. And this was launched at the World Congress of Cities in Ickley last June. And you can see once again that this agenda of protecting natural and cultural heritage sites are firmly embedded in the insurance industry development goals for cities, and also cross-cuts with issues that we have highlighted during this webinar on pollution, disaster resilience, sustainable energy. These are all cross-cutting issues, but there is a very specific goal on natural and cultural heritage sites as well. And then next slide, please. So what does the signing this statement of commitment on World Heritage Site actually mean? So this is an aspirational commitment. It's really the starting point for insurers to be aware. If you have not been looking at this issue, this is a perfect opportunity to say, well, we'd like to learn more and commit to better understanding this issue. We are also conscious of the fact that, you know, looking at entire insurance and investment portfolios, particularly if you are a global player, for example, it's not the easiest. And we do not expect everyone to be 100%, you know, have screened everything. But the real agenda here is the commitment to take action. Now that this agenda has been flagged, what is it that your company or organization can commit to in making sure that it can be part of the solution for this agenda? The other key point to mention here is that you can look at the statement of commitment as similar, akin to the principles for sustainable insurance that you have all signed on to. So the PSI was never meant to be a checklist, prescriptive checklist with which to comply, but really a generally direction to head into. So it is aspirational. We expect people to make a sincere effort to look into this issue and see what it is that you can do to better manage risks to World Heritage Sites within your risk management, insurance, and investment activities. And the simple reality is that no one can handle this agenda on its own. It's exactly the same motivation and why we developed the principles for sustainable insurance. All of these global sustainability challenges that we're facing right now, whether it is social inequality, climate change, environmental pollution, biodiversity loss, it's too big for any organization to handle. And that's the reason why we created the Principles for Sustainable Insurance. And that's exactly why we're doing the same thing. Obviously, the PSI cover ESG issues broadly, but what are these ESG issues? These actually boil down to issues like climate change, biodiversity loss, stuff that have been discussed throughout this webinar. And the real starting point is signing the statement saying you are one with others and saying you believe in this agenda, that you are willing to take action with others. Because the reality is that this is something that the industry has to collectively address in order to drive more meaningful change. Obviously, the Swiss Re's and the others out there can make a difference, but ultimately it will have to be an industry-wide agenda. And this is the reason why WWF is also quite excited of working with the PSI, because while they've had success with their engagement with some of the banks individually, they have not been able to engage the whole banking sector, for example, or an industry-wide agenda with the banks, and something that they are being able to do right now through the PSI. Next slide, please. And so we already have a bunch of insurance organizations, associations, and stakeholders who have taken that first step. Of saying, yes, we believe in this agenda. We are happy to take action on this agenda, and we're willing to work with others on this agenda. And working with others, not simply working with their peers in the insurance industry, but that also means working with civil society like WWF, working with the UN environment, where the PSI is housed, working with UNESCO on this agenda. And this is why we believe we have a lot more influence and capacity to actually make a difference because of the combination of actors involved in this initiative. Next slide, please. So if your organization has not yet signed on to the statement of commitment, there's actually two categories. So if you are an insurer, a reinsurer, a broker, or any company that provides services to insurance and reinsurance companies, that's category 1. You sign on as a signatory company. If you're an association, whether you're a national or regional insurance association or insurance regulator or an NGO, you sign on as a supporting institution. We'd like to be able to socialize this initiative more widely. We'd like to have as many founding signatories as possible to the statement under both categories. And we're looking at mid-September to be able to come up with more communications promoting this initiative to the global insurance industry and stakeholders. And hopefully that will also give time, especially for those in the north who are on summer holidays, to be able to get back and get on with internal processes on this agenda. And the sign-on process is very simple. Just email us through psiworldheritage@unffi.org, and that's enough for you to become a signatory. And that's, as I mentioned, this is just really the first step, is signing on to this statement. What are the other things? We have basically shaped and are shaping a work program to make sure that we don't start and end simply with a statement of commitment, but are able to follow through. And one of the things that we're going to be doing is going to be repeating and carrying out webinars such as this one, so that you stay informed of latest developments on what you can do, and how also what you think you can do, and share that with us. There will also be events related to this, so we're hoping to either build this agenda into key events, whether it's the Allianz event in Munich, or we're looking at the global event where we're going to engage cities and mayors, especially because we have the insurance industry development goals for cities. to what extent we can link this agenda there. We're also looking into developing guidance. So the statement itself is not can be viewed as some sort of a high-level guidance, but we can definitely go more granular into what are the specificities of risk management, insurance, and investment activities that would benefit from more granular guidance on this agenda. There's also tools. There are several tools out there that, for example, the integrated biodiversity assessment tool that are being used by companies and a few financial institutions and insurers. WWF has its own internal tool called WWF Site, which they're looking to develop and perhaps lead to something that insurers can use as part of their environmental risk management tool package. So those things are on the agenda. And also, as we were able to be part of the World Heritage Committee, the central meeting on this agenda this year in Bahrain, we also have the opportunity to once again say that this was not simply a flash in the pan initiative, but something where we can show and report on meaningful and substantial progress as we develop this engagement with the insurance industry on this agenda going forward. So next year is another opportunity for us to say, this is what the insurance industry has done and we're working on, and this is the progress that we're making. And with an initiative like that, we're hoping not only to achieve our end goal of protecting World Heritage Sites through the support of the insurance industry, but also for the insurance industry to actually motivate and inspire your peers in the financial community, banks, whether they can do a similar initiative, or even other industry sectors, whether they can do something that what the PSI has done as well. I thought I should pause there also to give Amandine some time. Amandine, if you have any additional thoughts on the next steps before we go into the questions, that would be great.
Thanks, Butch, very much for the summary. Like Butch said, the statement, it's really just for us the starting point of a long journey where we would love to work together with you to find solution on how you can actually implement the statement. So we are planning to work together with the insurance we signed to really develop some guidelines, some granular guideline on how you can have policy in place, how can you implement those policy in the different activities, your different business line, and also within the discussion around product, what kind of product could help safeguarding World Heritage Site. And a very important agenda for us is also the idea of exploring together what kind of tool and data could help you ensure, like having the knowledge to know basically your risk, the World Heritage risk better if you are insuring or if you're investing within a World Heritage Site. It's something we are working on, and something we will continue working on, and we love to work with you about it, and how to give access to the insurance to that kind of data, which are actually already existing out there. But now the question is how to best give you access, and in a way that makes sense for the industry. So for instance, in a tool that you already use, for instance, rather than having another tool. That's the kind of discussion we would love to have with an industry in the months coming. Yes.
So I think Olivia just noted a question from Nico in Australia, from Insurance Australia Group.
Yes, so the question we have received is, how strong of a disincentive is uninsurance or not having insurance for companies that want to take high-risk activities to World Heritage Sites? Is it enough to prevent the threats? And are there any examples where this has happened?
Right. So, so my view is that this is one of the things that exactly what the initiative is about. There is this hypothesis that insurers through risk management, insurance, and investment activities have influence on the behavior of companies. And in this context, for example, extractive companies and in the context of World Heritage Sites. And one agenda is not the provision of insurance, whether insurers could actually have clout in influencing behavior. And I think that's part of the agenda. That is the belief. And in terms of an initiative like this, and it's not only specific to these initiatives, for example, Nico. So we know that there are companies out there, AXA, for example, and Allianz and Swiss Re, who have used not only their investment clout, but their insurance, the provision of insurance cover in terms of making a call on coal-intensive businesses and not providing insurance coverage for that. And I think that has gotten traction in the insurance industry and still gaining momentum. There's even a campaign on that by civil society, for example, on the provision of insurance for coal companies, for example. So I think the idea is that yes, there is influence, and perhaps whether it's the question of whether it's enough or not is something that should not simply viewed as a standalone agenda, but perhaps taken in the context of the wider financial community. For example, if banks, investors, our insurers are all telling companies saying that you need to have environmental and social impact assessment, you need to be mindful of World Heritage Sites, there is the no-go commitment by the World Heritage Committee and being incompatible of extractive activities in World Heritage Sites, etc., then the influence will definitely be stronger. But there is obviously an agenda for insurers, and we are looking at insurers here not simply as an insurance, the provision of insurance, but also the capacity as investors and the capacity as risk managers in terms of understanding and reducing risk. There is another question. I think it's from James. Is it James? Is there willingness to review the principles? Are they set in stone? The time for consultation did not consider fully the insurance complexities. I think, James, the answer to that is that we obviously we consulted various insurers, obviously civil society also through WWF has provided input, and we're not. So there is the statement of commitment has been finalized. And these are aspirational, an aspirational statement of commitment. So we're treating them in the same way that we are treating the principles for sustainable insurance as a global framework. It's a starting point for action. The implementation could vary from company to company depending on your line of business and where you operate, etc. So we believe there is enough flexibility there, even in the wording itself, where, for example, looking at transactions has this phrase, for example, where possible, where you can actually realistically do it, or where it's only relevant to your business. And the input we've had is that for many that we have engaged is that it's flexible enough to be able to adjust into different insurance company peculiarities and processes. So as we're saying, it's not set in stone in a way that it's strictly by the letter type of assessment, but really saying We believe in this agenda, so we commit to take action. These are the 5 broad areas of action, and the specifics actually would come in the next stage, because one of the next activities is really developing guidance on this agenda. And as I mentioned, the statement is not really guidance per se. It could be viewed as some sort of a high level, some sort of starting point, especially for a company that hasn't started with anything on this agenda. But the real guidance will come into the next phases, and that's where we think a much more granular and specific guidelines will actually become more tangible and relevant as we progress. If you have other thoughts to add, Amandine, let me know.
No, I think but you summarized it very well, and all that comment are very well taken, James. We are really looking forward working with insurance, having that kind of comment that we could really integrate in the next phase, which is when we're really going to develop more granular guidance, where we will really be happy to also look more at the conservation, like you mentioned.
Okay. We just a last call for any other question out there.
While you wait for that, Butch, Chris here. I was just going to add back to the question of, does an insurer refusing cover mean that a company will change? We have seen the case both from the work we did on Soccer and Virunga, and since then, we're in discussions with a major oil company that for years refused to adopt a no-go policy for World Heritage sites when we asked them to, after some investors engaged with them, and now considering adopting a global no-go policy. So we're already seeing from our theory of change of if banks, investors and insurers engage these companies, that change will happen.
Right. Okay. With that, any other final thoughts from you, Chris, Amandine, before I share some final thoughts?
I guess I'd just like to say thank you all for your interest in this. I do hope you'll feel able to sign the principles and to help work with us on answering those questions that were posed earlier. We're stronger together when we work across sectors and find ways forward.
Amandine?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Not much to add. Just we're really looking forward working with you, and like Chris said, we hope that the statement is flexible enough for having insurance signing and starting really working with us on this journey, and starting brainstorming with us in a way on where and how the insurance can use the power it has, because it does has, for me, a lot of power, as even more than the banking industry, if I think about it personally, in enabling a project being done. Insurance have a lot of responsibility and power there. So we're really looking forward starting this discussion.
Yes, and from our side here at the PSI Secretariat in Geneva, I think one of the personally, what I've learned along the process is that, ultimately, if you look at an initiative like this and look at the agenda, these are basically the things that matter most to humanity. And this is encapsulated in the World Heritage Convention, and supposed to be priceless and irreplaceable. So these are exactly the battles that we have to win, in terms of how do we make sure that we have peaceful coexistence with nature and the environment, etc. And the reality is that the human activity and corporate activity has actually led to the damage of these priceless and irreplaceable assets. And the reality is that it's not simply a financial sector agenda, as Amandine mentioned. The governments have a big responsibility as well industry, the business community have a big industry as well, and obviously the financial sector as well. And there is this golden opportunity for the insurance industry to exercise leadership. For, more often than not, within the financial community, normally the banks are referred to most of the time in terms of how they're leading an agenda. And this is an opportunity for the insurers to actually avoid being tagged as the tortoise in this agenda of looking at protecting World Heritage Sites and actually exercising leadership. And ultimately, beyond what has been said so far, I think the key point for the PSI as an initiative, whether it's the ESG and underwriting initiative, whether it's the insurance industry development goals for cities, whether it's the tobacco-free finance pledge initiative or the illegal fishing initiative that you'll hear more soon about, it's really about the vision and the leadership and commitment of the insurance industry to take action on things that matter most, and that there is strength in numbers. And this is what we're trying to do. This is not simply a single company agenda. This is an industry-wide agenda. And behind the industry, you actually have civil society like WWF and the UN behind you. So we have a great opportunity in our hands. And this is the moment to actually say this is something that we can do collectively going forward. So we have more of these to come in the succeeding months. Thank you to all of you for participating, especially for those in Down Under and the Far East who have stayed awake late in the day for them. We are 9 minutes ahead of schedule, so you have 9 more minutes of beauty sleep. And for those of you in Europe, have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.